The long nights of the north held a secret many have forgotten. People in Viking times had the best sleep in history. Beneath the timbered roofs of halls and cottages, rest was not stolen in haste, but welcomed as a gift from the gods themselves. A Viking man, weary from toil in the field, or from steering his ship across storm-grey seas, did not toss uneasily into slumber. His sleep was deep, unbroken by the noise of strange devices or the glare of false light. He lay wrapped in wool and fur, his breath rising and falling with the hearth's fading glow, while the night beyond was black and absolute, as it had always been. For the Viking child curled beside kin, warmth came not from lonely chambers, but from shared bodies and trusted arms. To sleep in such closeness was to know safety, to let the mind drift without fear that wolves or raiders would strike unseen. Sleep was woven into the rhythm of life, part of the same pattern as the planting of seed, the swing of an axe, or the raising of a drinking horn. Even the Viking woman, mistress of the home and keeper of the fire, found her rest upon beds of straw and herbs, scents of lavender and sweet woodruff softening the edges of weariness. Night fell differently upon their world. The sun bowed low, and darkness came fully, cloaking the land in silence. It was in this darkness that the Viking spirit gave itself over to slumber. Sleep was not a burden, not a weakness, but a time when the body mended and the soul might wander the realm of dreams, perhaps touched by Odin's wisdom or by the whisper of ancestors. Dreams carried meaning, and to wake from them was to rise with purpose. The Viking gift of sleep lay also in their freedom from measure. There was no ticking of unseen hours, no restless counting of minutes. Instead, sleep followed the arc of firelight and the turning of the seasons. In winter, when night stretched long as sagas, they lingered longer beneath blankets of fur. In summer, when light barely left the sky, their rest was shorter, yet still enough, for the balance was natural. To live as a Viking was to sleep as one, with trust in the darkness, with kin at your side, with work enough in the day to earn the peace of night. It was not mere slumber, but a communion with nature's order. And so it may be said, with truth and wonder, that people in Viking times had the best sleep in history, for theirs was not stolen, nor troubled, but given freely, deep as the northern night. When the sun dipped beneath the rim of the fjord, and the last streak of crimson faded from the sky, the world of the north was swallowed by a darkness so complete it seemed alive. This was the blanket under which the Viking lay, heavier and more certain than any woven cloth. To a Viking man returning from the fields, sweat crusting his brow, or to a Viking child pressed close to his mother's side, the night was not feared, it was trusted. Darkness was their ally, the gift that stilled the body and hushed the restless mind. The Viking woman tending the fire let its glow falter until only embers remained, the faint red pulse lighting the hall with a gentle breath. Beyond the door there was nothing but shadow. No torch, no lantern, no sound of wheels or hammers through the night, only the long hush of the land at rest. And in that hush, the body gave way to slumber with ease, for the world itself seemed to demand it. The eyes found no glare, no flicker, but flame. The mind drifted as naturally as a ship upon tide. True darkness shaped the Viking soul. In winter, when night reigned for endless hours, the people yielded to its command, stretching long upon their beds of straw, furs pulled tight around them. A Viking man might rise after his first sleep, sit by the fire, whisper to the gods, then sink once more into second sleep, as if the darkness itself called him back. The rhythm was gentle, as though the night had two heartbeats, steady and strong. This deep shadow brought not only rest but healing. A Viking body, worn by axe or oar, found recovery in those hours, the muscles loosening, the spirit quieting. Dreams rose from that pure blackness like smoke from a hearth, carrying omens, comfort, or warnings. To wake in such dark silence, then fall again into slumber, was to drink deeply from a well untouched by time. The strength of their rest, lay in the certainty of night. Darkness told the Viking child it was safe to close his eyes, told the Viking woman her labours were done, told the Viking man that the gods themselves had veiled the world so mortals might renew their strength. It was not a burden but a blessing, a vast cloak laid across the land by unseen hands. And so, as the sagas whisper, when darkness ruled the north, the people embraced it. It was more than absence of light, it was the keeper of their dreams, the healer of their weariness, and the reason why Viking times gave birth to the soundest sleep the world has ever known. The hearth was the heart of every Viking home, its glow a faithful companion through the long northern nights. When the day's labours ended and the wind howled against timbered walls, families gathered around its crackling warmth. A Viking man, broad-shouldered from work in the fields or sea, would stretch weary limbs beside the flames. A Viking woman, keeper of the home's flame, laid her spindle aside as the fire dimmed. The Viking child, full from simple Viking food of bread and broth, curled close to kin, eyelids heavy as sparks leapt and died. The light of the hearth was no harsh blaze, but a soft and flickering pulse like the breathing of the house itself. Shadows stretched along the beams, danced across fur blankets, and clung to carved bedposts. This wavering glow guided the eyes towards stillness, not restlessness. It coaxed the body downward, telling bone and sinew that the day was finished, that the time had come to surrender. A Viking could feel the shift as surely as the tide. With each crackle and sigh of the fire, the world grew slower, gentler, and ready for sleep. The fading flame offered a bridge between wakefulness and dreams. It was never abrupt, never jarring. The fire would sink from blaze to ember, and with it, voices in the hall softened, hands fell idle, and breath became steady. In that dimness, a Viking man might whisper to his gods, or a Viking woman might murmur old tales to the children, their faces lit by the last orange light. Sleep did not fall suddenly. It seeped into the hall as naturally as mist rolls over the fjord. The hearth's glow was also a guardian. Its warmth kept frost at bay, its flicker warned of intruders, and its embers glowed like watchful eyes long after men lay in slumber. To rest with such a glow nearby was to rest without fear. The Viking child knew the fire would hold the dark at the threshold. The Viking woman knew the warmth would cradle her kin through the night. When at last the fire sank to a quiet bed of coals, the hall lay in hushed shadow, its people already adrift in deep slumber. No other light remained, only the memory of the hearth's gentle glow still painted on their closed eyes. And in that passage from fire to darkness, their bodies and spirits eased into sleep with the grace of nature's rhythm. Thus, the hearth was more than flame. It was the keeper of peace, the soft hand that carried Viking folk from toil into rest, a natural glow that led them gently toward the deepest sleep the world has ever known. The night for a Viking did not pass in one unbroken stretch, but in two steady waves, like the tide upon the shore. These biphasic nights, as the skalds might have named them, were as natural to the north as the turning of seasons. After a day of toil, when the hearth's glow had dwindled to embers, a Viking man would lay himself upon straw and wool, his body sinking deep into the first sleep. For 4 or so hours, silence reigned, broken only by the breath of kin and the crackle of dying coals. Then, as if guided by unseen hands, eyes would open in the hush of midnight. This was not restlessness, nor was it weakness. It was expected, part of the rhythm known to every Viking child and Viking woman alike. In those quiet hours, when the world beyond the walls was drowned in shadow, the household stirred gently. A man might rise to whisper a prayer to Thor or Odin, seeking strength or counsel. A woman might nurse her babe or tend quietly to the fire, laying another log upon the embers to keep frost from creeping in. For many, this waking was sacred. Some spoke softly with kin, sharing secrets and laughter that daylight never allowed. Others sought closeness in the privacy of the night. a bond between husband and wife kindled when all else lay still. A Viking child might open his eyes to see the shapes of his elders moving by the fire, then drift back, untroubled, into dreams. Even the beasts outside, horses and goats, were checked upon in this hour, their well-being tied to the family's survival. And when the quiet work or prayers were done, the second sleep would come. This slumber, deeper than the first, carried the Viking spirit through until dawn. In it, the body restored its strength, and the mind wandered into dreamscapes where gods and ancestors might whisper. To rise at last with the crow of the rooster, or the first streak of sun, was to feel renewed, as though one had been given 2 nights in the space of one. This rhythm of first sleep and second sleep was no accident, but the natural order of things. The Viking man did not fight it, nor did the Viking woman see it as a burden. It was a gift, a pause in the middle of darkness that gave space for thought, devotion, or tenderness. And in returning to the firs after that midnight hour, they surrendered themselves to the deepest rest, certain that the gods had carved this pattern for their good. Thus did the Vikings sleep, not in haste, not in fragments of worry, but in 2 measured tides of slumber, as steady and timeless as the sea itself. The midnight hour, in the Viking world, was no curse of wakefulness, but a gift wrapped in silence and shadow. When the first sleep had run its course, and the hall stirred from its stillness, a Viking man would rise from his bed of straw and fur, the glow of the hearth's embers painting his face with faint red light. This was the hour between slumbers, when the land was hushed, when the gods themselves seemed to lean closer to hear the whispers of mortals. In that calm, a Viking woman might murmur prayers, her lips forming soft invocations to Freya for love, or to Frigg for protection of kin. The darkness made sacred space, where words spoken felt closer to the divine. Monks in distant cloisters prayed their night offices at this same time, and the Viking too, though in his own way, found the quiet perfect for tending to the spirit. A Viking child, half awake, would watch the faint shapes of his elders moving by the fire and feel the calm of knowing all was well. Yet this hour was not only for prayer. In the warmth of the hall, voices often lifted in low tales. Storytelling was the marrow of the Viking spirit, and what better time to weave sagas than in the deep of night, when minds were unclouded by labour and hearts were open. A man might recount the deeds of ancestors, or the voyages of longships across seas unknown. A woman might share wisdom through riddles and proverbs, her words shaping the minds of her children. The hush of midnight wrapped these tales in reverence, so they lingered long after the embers died. For some, the midnight hour drew them closer in ways that daylight did not permit. Couples found privacy when others slept, a stolen moment of warmth beneath fur and wool. Viking men and Viking women knew this interval as a time when the body, rested from the first sleep, was renewed in strength, and the bond between them deepened. Intimacy was not hurried, but part of the natural rhythm of night, woven into the same pattern as prayer and storytelling. Practical tasks, too, found their place in this watchful hour. A Viking man might step into the cold to check the pens where livestock slept, ensuring no predator prowled near. A Viking woman might rise to stir the fire so that it did not die completely, the crackle of new flame offering comfort to all. Such acts were small, yet vital, and they fit naturally within the midnight pause. When the quiet tasks were done, prayers whispered, tales told, and bonds shared, the people returned to their bedding. The second sleep awaited, deeper and more healing than the first. And so the midnight hour, far from being restless or wasted, became the heart of the Viking night, a sacred bridge between waking and dreaming, between mortal and divine. The turning of seasons ruled every breath of Viking life, and so too did it shape their slumber. In the dark heart of winter, when night stretched like an endless cloak across the north, a Viking man might spend near half his day wrapped in furs, surrendering to the great stillness. The long cold hours demanded it, for the sun rode low and gave little warmth or light. Fires burned steadily, and families huddled close, Viking women sewing by the hearth, Viking children drifting into slumber long before the rooster's call. Their bodies followed the season's command, sinking into deeper, longer rest, as though the land itself urged them to conserve strength for survival. Yet when summer came, the rhythm changed. Twilight lingered late, and dawn's light returned before a Viking man could finish his dreams. Work called at first light, for fields needed tending, and longships awaited the tide. In these months, their sleep grew shorter, but it did not weaken them. The Viking woman found rest in broken stretches, rising early to tend animals and prepare Viking food before the day's labour began. A Viking child, lulled by the endless glow of the northern sky, might tumble into sleep while elders still sang or told tales. This shifting rhythm was no burden, but harmony with nature. In winter, sleep was long and heavy, like the earth beneath snow. In summer, it was brief but steady, punctuated by rest at midday, when heat and toil called for pause. The Viking understood that sleep, like the sea, rose and fell with the season. Their bodies did not rebel against it, but yielded, flowing with the cycle. The sagas speak of winter nights, where stories stretched late, the hall filled with the sound of voices, until silence fell, and all gave themselves to slumber. In summer tales, warriors speak of rising with the first light, their eyes sharpened by shorter rest, yet renewed by the fire of the season. Neither pattern was wrong, both belonged to the order of life. The Viking gift lay in this surrender. Where others might strain against the pull of darkness or curse the endless light, they adapted, trusting that the gods had made the seasons as they should be. Sleep was never forced into one mould. A Viking man did not count the hours, nor did a Viking woman fret over too much or too little. They slept as the land allowed, as the sun and moon decreed. And so, whether beneath the endless black of winter or the glowing veil of summer twilight, the Viking spirit found balance. Their slumber was not bound by rigid rule, but by the breathing of the world itself, long in the cold, brief in the warmth, always enough, always in tune with the rhythm of the north. In the world of the north, no one truly slept alone. The Viking night was not carved into private chambers or lonely beds, but shared, as all of life was shared in toil, in food, in danger, and in rest. A Viking man laid his head beside kin, wife at his side, children pressed close, the family bound together beneath wool and fur. The warmth of bodies was their shield against the long cold, for the hall's fire could not always reach the farthest corners, and winter winds seeped through timber and stone. It was the closeness of kin that kept frost from biting. In peasant cottages, the hearth glowed faintly while families slept in a single room, every soul within earshot of another's breathing. A Viking woman drew her children near, her arm across them like a second blanket, her presence as much protection as any wall. Even the Viking child, lulled by the steady rise and fall of his father's chest or the whispered songs of his mother, found comfort not in silence but in nearness. To hear a brother's snore, to feel the twitch of a sister's dream, was to know one was not alone in the dark. In the grand halls of chieftains, men shared space as naturally as they shared the mead horn. Warriors rested shoulder to shoulder, their weapons close, trust binding them as firmly as their oaths. To lie beside one's shield brother was to know security. If danger crept into the night, no man would wake alone. And aboard longships, rocked by restless seas, Viking men slept where they sat, side by side, wrapped in cloaks against the spray, their slumber shallow yet steadfast, bound by the strength of brotherhood. This way of sleeping together carried more than warmth. It carried trust. To close one's eyes beside another was to surrender to them in the most vulnerable of hours. Families strengthened their bonds through such nights, and companions grew closer, their breath mingling with the smoke of the dying fire. The Viking woman saw her household as a single body, Each member joined to the next, and in their shared rest she kept them whole. Sleep itself became a social bond, as vital as shared work and shared meals of Viking food. It taught the young to rely on kin, and it taught the old to guard the weak. In a world where wolves prowled the forest and raiders crossed the seas, survival lay in unity, and the night was no different. Thus, the Vikings did not fear the dark. They embraced it together. They slept as one family, friend, warrior, child, their warmth rising like smoke to the beams, their trust stronger than frost or fear. In this closeness, they found not only rest, but the deepest security, a reminder that the Viking way of life was never solitary, but always bound in kinship, even in dreams. The Viking bedstead was no lifeless frame of wood and straw, but a cradle fashioned by hand and wisdom, built to carry men and women into the deepest slumber. A Viking man, weary from axe and oar, laid his body upon a mattress thick with straw or reeds, the crackle beneath softened by wool and linen. Over him, heavy blankets of fleece or fur pressed warmth into his bones, sealing him against the breath of northern frost. Even in the humblest cottage, the bedding was alive with the scents of earth and field. For herbs, lavender, chamomile, or sweet woodruff were strewn among the layers, their fragrance lulling the spirit into peace. To the Viking woman, the making of the bed was an art as sacred as brewing ale or baking bread. She knew which straw was driest, which herbs kept away biting insects, which feathers gave the softest rest. In noble halls, feather beds of goose down were treasured heirlooms, passed from mother to daughter, their comfort reserved for the honoured. Yet even the peasant bed, refreshed with new straw at the turning of seasons, held a kind of purity our eyes might not see, but the Viking child surely felt, pressing cheek to linen, drifting into sleep without worry of pest or chill. The bedstead itself was built of sturdy oak or pine, carved plain in farmhouses or richly adorned in the chambers of jarls. High headboards rose to shield the sleeper from draughts, and curtains of wool or linen could be drawn to trap warmth and shadow. In these enclosed spaces, sleep grew deeper, cocooned in softness and scent. A Viking man, drifting into dreams after long feasting, might feel the faint rustle of straw beneath him, and the perfume of herbs rising about his face, carrying him gently into the realm of gods and ancestors. These natural beds breathed with the seasons, straw insulated in winter, keeping the chill of earth at bay, and in summer it cooled, letting air move beneath the sleeper. Wool absorbed the damp, feathers wrapped the body, and herbs calmed the mind. Everything worked in harmony, a bedstead woven from the gifts of land and beast. The Viking people did not know of chemicals or artifice. Their comfort was born from what they tended with their own hands, and it was enough. Thus the Viking bedstead was more than a place to lie. It was a sanctuary, a fortress of warmth and scent, a trusted resting place where the body shed its burdens and the soul could wander free. With straw beneath, wool above, feathers cradling, and herbs soothing, the Vikings slept not in hardship, but in nature's perfect embrace, a rest as deep and restorative as any in history. The Viking night was not scented with smoke alone. It carried with it the fragrance of herbs, carefully chosen, and laid among straw and wool to guide the body into rest. To a Viking man, weary from toil with axe or plough, the faint sweetness of lavender sown into his bedding was more than perfume. It was a balm, softening his spirit as the fire dimmed. A Viking woman, mistress of the hall and keeper of its secrets, would gather sprigs of chamomile, sweet woodruff, and rose, knowing each plant's gift to slumber. She worked them into sachets, or scattered them loosely in straw, so that the bed itself breathed calm. The herbs were more than adornment. Chamomile soothed the stomach and eased the restless mind. Lavender cooled the fire of worry and quieted the heart. Sweet woodruff, with its honeyed scent, wrapped the senses in a gentle haze, a reminder of spring meadows even in the bleakest winter. To a Viking child pressing cheek to pillow, These scents were comfort itself, a mother's touch carried on the air. In great halls, where feasting and song often lingered until the moon was high, the bedding of nobles carried richer blends. Sage to purify, thyme to protect, roses to delight. But even in humble cottages, herbs grew in small plots beside the door, gathered not only for stews and Viking food, but for the night's rest. The knowledge of their power was passed through generations, whispered as wisdom from mother to daughter, healer to apprentice. Sleep in such fragrant beds was not only deeper, but touched with dreams. Men spoke of visions more vivid when herbs cradled their rest, of dreams that carried them across seas, into halls of gods, or before the faces of ancestors. The scents were believed to open pathways for the soul, to protect the sleeper from spirits that wandered in darkness. A Viking woman might murmur charms as she laid the herbs, believing that their fragrance carried blessings as well as rest. These plants, stitched into bedding, bound the people to earth and season. They reminded the Viking man of fields in bloom, even when snow lay heavy. They reminded the Viking child of summer warmth, though the wind clawed at the roof. They turned every bedstead, no matter how humble, into a sanctuary where body and spirit could surrender without fear. Thus the night was never barren. It was alive with fragrance, herbs mingling with smoke and wool, creating a harmony the Vikings trusted with their slumber. And in that harmony lay the secret of their rest, not the silence alone, nor the darkness, but the sense of slumber, weaving calm into every breath until morning broke. The Viking did not always lie flat as the dead when he sought rest. More often, he settled into slumber with his body lifted, his chest and head propped by bolsters of wool, feathers, or even herbs. This reclined rest was no accident, but a wisdom born of need and tradition. A Viking man, heavy from a day's labour and from hearty Viking food of bread, meat, and ale, knew that to lie flat was to invite discomfort. Propped upon cushions, he breathed easier, his body easing into sleep with less strain, his dreams unbroken by the weight of his own feast. The Viking woman, keeper of the hall's health, arranged these bolsters carefully, for she knew the balance between comfort and harm. Too low, and the sleeper's breath would falter. Too high, and the neck would ache. But at the right incline, slumber came like a tide, smooth and steady. A Viking child, small and restless, might nestle against such propped pillows and drift with ease, lulled by the gentle rise of his body and the warmth of the furs above him. This way of sleeping served more than comfort. The reclined rest aided the belly in its work, allowing food to settle without burden. A Viking man who had eaten well could surrender to slumber without the sour bite of troubled digestion. The position also kept the chest open, letting air flow freely, so that even in the coldest nights, with smoke from the hearth lingering, breath remained strong. For those with wounds or weariness heavy upon their bodies, this posture eased their pain, granting them a deeper and more healing sleep. Carved bedsteads often showed high headboards to support such rest, and curtains could be drawn close, enclosing the sleeper in warmth. To the outside eye, it may have seemed as though the Vikings were forever half awake, seated in their beds like watchmen. Yet this was the strength of the practice, to sleep and still hold a posture of readiness, as if the body itself was guarded even while the spirit wandered in dreams. The sagas speak of chieftains and kings resting in such manner, their attendants close at hand, while warriors on campaign leaned upon shields or cloaks, never stretched flat, always half poised for action. Sleep in this reclined form was both restful and vigilant, a merging of peace and preparedness. Thus, the reclined rest was more than habit. It was a reflection of Viking life itself, practical, wise, and ever balanced between ease and endurance. It kept the body whole, the breath steady, the belly calm, and in that posture, propped and protected, the Viking man, woman, and child found a sleep both gentle and strong, as fitting for their world as the sagas they dreamed within it. The Viking night was never silent, nor was it meant to be. Within the hall, where kin and companions lay close beneath furs, the air was filled with the rhythm of bodies at rest. A Viking man, broad-chested and weary from oar or plough, let out a thunderous snore that rolled across the room like distant surf. A Viking child stirred in his sleep, turning against the straw mattress with a faint rustle. The soft murmur of a Viking woman's breath blended with the crackle of embers, weaving a soundscape as natural as wind through the pines or waves against the shore. These sounds were not curses to the sleeper's ear, but comfort. To hear the slow, steady breathing of kin was to know one was not alone. The shifting of a companion's weight upon the bedstead, the cough of an elder in the dark, the sigh of a babe each, was a reminder of closeness, of safety. In a world where wolves prowled the edge of the forest and enemies might strike at dawn, these familiar sounds were proof of life, proof of unity, proof that the hall still stood strong around them. Even in the grandest longhouse, where warriors lay side by side, the chorus of the night was the same. Men turning upon cloaks, the scrape of a shield moved for comfort, the muttered dream speech of one lost in visions. These were no disturbances. They were the heartbeat of the hall itself. The Viking man learned from youth that sleep was not a solitary thing, but a shared surrender, and with that came the sounds of others. On ships too, the same music carried through the night. Viking warriors, wrapped in cloaks upon the benches, shifted with the swell of the sea. Oars creaked faintly, ropes groaned, and breath mingled with the salt wind. To sleep in such company was to be rocked by more than the waves. It was to be lulled by the harmony of men at rest together, brothers in both waking and dreaming. These sounds taught patience, trust, and acceptance. A Viking woman did not hush her husband's rumbling breath, nor did the Viking child fear the heavy snore of his grandfather. Such noises were part of the fabric of life, as much as the howl of wind or the call of the rooster. They grounded the sleeper, reminding him that he was not a lone soul adrift in darkness, but bound to others by blood and bond. Thus, the sounds of the night carried no sting of disruption, but the comfort of kinship. They were proof of breath, warmth, and life within the hall. In this chorus of rest, snore, and sigh, cough and whisper, the Vikings slept deeply, their dreams cradled not by silence, but by the living presence of those around them. The Vikings rose not to the shriek of iron or the sting of sudden noise, but to the gentle summons of the world itself. When dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in pale gold, the first sounds of waking stirred within the hall. A rooster's crow split the stillness, not as a jarring cry, but as a herald of morning. Its voice carried across the farmstead, calling Viking man and Viking woman alike to the day's labours. To the Viking child, still drowsy beneath woolen covers, that crow was as natural as a lullaby, reversed the signal that dreams must give way to life. In villages, the church bell sometimes joined the rooster, its toll heavy and slow, rolling across the air like waves on stone. It was not cruel or rushed, but solemn, steady, reminding all that another day had begun under the gaze of the gods. For the Viking man, it was a summons to work. For the Viking woman, a sign to stoke the fire and set bread to bake. For the Viking child, the cue to rise and wash in cold water, shaking off the heaviness of night. The truest awakening, however, came with the light itself. Homes without glass let the first glow filter through oiled parchment or the cracks in timber. It did not blaze all at once, but crept slowly, filling the room like water rising in a tide. The Viking body stirred to that light, for it was the rhythm it had always known. To wake with the sun was to feel in harmony with the world, the heart calm, the mind ready, the limbs steady for toil. No Viking feared the moment of rising. There was no harsh demand that tore them from sleep in panic, no clamour that startled the heart into racing. Instead, Waking was a passage from darkness to faint sound, to dim light, to the full blaze of morning. A Viking man might sit upon the edge of his bedstead, rub the sleep from his eyes, and feel his strength renewed. A Viking woman might whisper a short prayer of thanks before stirring the hearth. A Viking child might stretch, yawn, and blink into the soft glow that spread across the hall. The rooster, the bell, the sun, these were guardians of time, each marking the new day with patience and steadiness. They did not tear men from dreams, but guided them gently back to waking. And in that grace of rising, the Vikings carried into the day what they had gathered in the night: strength, peace, and the memory of sleep unmarred by fear. To wake in such a way was to be truly alive, for the world itself was the hand that lifted them from their dreams. When the sun rode high and the fields shimmered with heat, the Viking knew the wisdom of pause. The day's first labours were done, the nets hauled, the earth turned, the beasts fed, and with bellies filled from their main meal of bread, cheese, fish, or other Viking food, the body called for stillness. The nap at noon was no sign of weakness, but of balance, a gift taken in harmony with the season. A Viking man, his arms heavy from axe or plough, stretched upon a bench, or lay back against the wall of the hall, eyes closing as easily as if sleep itself had been waiting beside him. For the Viking woman, it was the briefest respite between morning tasks and the endless duties of afternoon. She might rest with her babe at her breast, drifting into slumber while the faint hum of bees filled the air outside. A Viking child, wearied from play or from small chores about the home, curled into straw or furs, his soft breath mingling with the hush that settled over the stead. Even warriors, hardened and ever alert, gave themselves to rest when the sun blazed fiercest, their cloaks drawn over their heads, trusting that the world itself kept watch at midday. Summer called for such pauses most of all. The long hours of light stretched work into the evening, and without rest, strength would falter. The nap at noon restored what the morning had spent, readying the body for the labours that awaited in the fields, at the forge, or by the shore. It was a rhythm as natural as the sea's tide. Morning toil, midday slumber, evening work, and night's long sleep. The sagas speak not often of such moments, for heroes are remembered more for battle than for rest, yet in quiet lines and hints it is known. A Viking man might say that wisdom lies not in endless striving, but in yielding when the body demands it. The gods themselves were thought to have woven rest into the fabric of life. To deny it was folly, to accept it was strength. The nap was short, never indulgent. Perhaps the length of a song sung softly, or the time it took the shadows to shift upon the floor. Yet, even so, it brought a clarity, a sharpening of mind and sinew. To wake from it was to feel reborn into the day, ready once more to wield hammer till earth, or steer the prow into the tide. Thus the nap at noon was part of the Viking gift of sleep, not a stealing of hours, but a rightful claim to balance. In the heart of summer, when the sun refused to rest, the Vikings found a way to honour both work and body, letting sleep come in small measure so strength might endure until the day's final glow. As the day bent toward dusk and the labours of field and forge came to their close, the evening meal was laid with quiet simplicity. Unlike the heavy feasts of midday, when a Viking man filled his belly with meat, fish, and rich Viking food to fuel his strength, the night demanded less. A bowl of porridge, dark bread, still warm from the hearth, a slice of cheese, perhaps a handful of dried berries, or a spoon of honey, such was the fare that prepared the body for slumber. The wisdom of light suppers was well known. A Viking woman, skilled in the tending of her household, chose carefully what to serve, for she knew that the stomach's burden weighed upon the night's rest. Too much meat, too much ale, and dreams would turn restless, the body twisting upon its straw bed. But a modest meal, easy upon the gut, brought stillness, and the Viking child who ate sparingly at dusk drifted more swiftly into peace. The fire's glow softened as families gathered in their halls. Viking men spoke of the day's deeds, women hushed children with gentle words, and the evening food was shared in calm. There was no rush, no clamour, only the steady rhythm of chewing and the crackle of the hearth. In this, the body began its descent toward rest, already eased by the simplicity of the food. Even herbs found their place in these meals. Chamomile might be steeped in warm milk, or mint stirred into a small drink, easing belly and spirit alike. Honey sweetened such draughts, its golden touch believed to soothe the heart. These were not luxuries, but the common wisdom of the North, passed down from elder to child. A Viking man might rise early for raids, a Viking woman for the tending of beasts, but all knew that a night of proper sleep began not with the bedstead alone, but with the food taken as darkness fell. The sagas do not dwell on suppers, for battles and voyages stir the blood more than bread and broth, yet beneath the songs lies this unspoken truth. Strength was born not only of the axe, but of the meal that prepared one for sleep. To eat rightly at night was to rise stronger at dawn. And so, as shadows deepened, the Vikings ate lightly, their minds untroubled, their bodies eased. Bread, cheese, porridge, humble food, yet powerful in its purpose. It guided them gently from toil to slumber, from the noise of day to the silence of night. Thus the evening meal, modest and wise, became the quiet hand that ushered Viking folk into the best sleep in history. As the day drew its last breath and the fire dimmed to embers, the Vikings turned to drink not for revelry alone, but for rest. The horn that passed from Viking man to Viking woman in the quiet of evening was often filled not with strong brew to stir wild song, but with ale light of strength, or mead thinned with water and herbs. These night draughts, humble and mild, were no burden to the body. Instead, they soothed it, carrying the mind toward dreams, as gently as a boat glides into still water. The ale of the North was not the heavy drink of later ages. Brewed weak, often no stronger than milk, it was safe to sip when water could not be trusted, and soft enough to ease the belly without stirring heat in the blood. A Viking child, too young for the horn, would watch his elders sip while he was offered warm milk with honey or herbal infusions steeped by careful hands. A Viking woman might crush chamomile or steep mint to calm her kin, while men who had carried axes all day found peace in the warmth of drink that eased weary limbs. Mead, golden and sweet, held a place of honour. It was a gift of bees, a drink of celebration, but also of solace. Thinned and sipped in small measure, it gladdened the heart without dulling it. To taste mead before sleep was to feel the lingering fire of summer blossoms, even in the depth of winter. Many believed it opened the way to richer dreams, dreams in which the gods might speak, or ancestors walk once more among the living. Herbal brews were the quiet secrets of the hearth. A Viking woman, healer of her household, gathered lavender, yarrow, or valerian, steeping them into drinks that calmed the restless and brought the heavy-eyed to peace. Such herbs carried no thunder but worked as whispers, slowing the breath, easing the spirit. They were offered in clay cups, their steam mingling with the scents of wool and smoke, binding the sleeper to the earth as surely as the blankets bound him to warmth. It was said that the draught before bed did more than ease the body. It bridged the waking world and the dream. A Viking man, sipping his ale in the hush of night, could feel his thoughts loosen, his mind slipping from the weight of toil into the realm of visions. A Viking child, lulled with milk and honey, drifted to dream with the same ease, safe under his mother's gaze. So it was that ale, mead, and herbs wove themselves into the Viking night. They were not indulgence, but aid, not excess, but balance. These nightcaps, light and natural, softened the path into slumber and opened the doors of dreaming. And in those dreams, vivid, wild, and often touched by the gods, the Vikings found not only rest but wisdom, carried to them on the golden breath of their evening cup. Sleep for the Viking was not coaxed or fought for. It came as surely as night itself, carried on the weight of toil, From the first light of dawn until the fading of the sun, every hour was carved with labour. A Viking man bent his back to the plough, shoulders straining as he turned the earth, or rowed the longship through restless seas until his hands burned raw upon the oar. A Viking woman moved with tireless grace, grinding grain, weaving cloth, tending beasts, her strength no less than that of her husband. Even the Viking child had tasks, small but steady, fetching water, gathering wood, learning that life was built on effort. This unbroken rhythm of labour etched itself into the body, so when the hearth dimmed and shadows lengthened, weariness was not a foe but a companion. Sleep came swiftly to such bodies, weary yet satisfied, heavy with the kind of fatigue that asks for no coaxing. A Viking man, who had swung an axe all day, did not lie awake in restlessness. His muscles surrendered him to dreams. A Viking woman, her hands rough from loom or churn, closed her eyes and slipped into slumber without struggle. For them, rest was not stolen, but earned. The clang of the smith's hammer by day echoed faintly in dreams by night. The farmer's rhythm of sowing and reaping wove itself into his slumber, steady as the seasons. The rower's arms, aching from the sea's demand, found healing in the deep tide of sleep that followed. Even the simplest labour, carrying water, splitting logs, tending sheep, drained the body just enough to welcome rest without hesitation. Fatigue was not seen as weakness. It was proof of a life well spent. The sagas speak of warriors who, after long marches or days of battle, lay down upon their cloaks and were asleep before the moon rose high. This was the Viking gift, to live so close to the land and sea that work itself prepared the way for sleep, as natural as fire to flame. In winter, when daylight was scarce, the labours shifted but did not vanish. Nets were mended, tools sharpened, wool spun by the fire. Fatigue still came, though of a quieter kind, and sleep still followed, long and heavy, as the world outside froze in silence. In summer, when light stretched far into the evening, toil grew harsher, yet the midday nap and the night's rest restored what was taken. Thus did labour shape slumber. There was no need for potions or charms to summon sleep when the body had given itself fully to the day. The Viking man slept with the ease of one who had ploughed his share of earth. The Viking woman dreamed with the calm of one who had kept her household strong. And the Viking child, weary from small duties, curled into furs knowing fatigue would cradle him into the deepest rest. In this, the Vikings held a secret. We have forgotten that true sleep is born of honest toil. In the halls of power, sleep was no less sacred than in the cottages of peasants, yet it bore the weight of ritual and rank. The king's chamber was a place of ceremony, where slumber itself became a mark of his station. A Viking king, broad of shoulder and heavy with the burdens of rule, did not simply collapse into straw as a common farmer might. His rest was attended, witnessed, and guarded, for the body of a ruler was the vessel of his people's fate. When night drew near, the coucher was a rite. Attendants, sworn to silence and loyalty, laid out the bedstead with care. Fine linens, woven from flax, thick blankets of wool, and furs of bear or reindeer were arranged to cradle their lord in warmth. Feather pillows, rare and treasured, propped his head in a reclined rest. A Viking noblewoman might share this chamber, her presence both consort and guardian, for queens and wives carried not only affection, but power within these walls. Before the king lay down, prayers or invocations were often spoken. Some called upon Thor for strength, others upon Freya for fertility and blessing, or upon Odin for dreams that might carry wisdom from the unseen. The chamber grew hushed, as if the gods themselves leaned closer. The Viking man who was king surrendered his sword and cloak, his attendants folding them near at hand, symbols of his authority never far, even in sleep. Yet the king did not sleep alone. At his side or at the edges of the chamber, men of trust lay upon trundle beds or cloaks, their ears sharp through the night. For though he was a ruler, he was also vulnerable, and the bonds of loyalty extended even into slumber. To share the air of his chamber was to share responsibility for his life. The Viking child who one day would grow to serve in such a place learned early that to guard a leader's rest was as noble as to fight by his side. Even kings, however, were bound to the same rhythms as their people. Despite the finery, the embers of the hearth still dimmed, the chamber still sank into darkness, and the breath of those gathered rose and fell in unison. The king's dreams, though richer in omen, were carried on the same tide of biphasic nights, of midnight wakings, of silence broken only by whispers or prayer. Thus the king's chamber was not merely a place of sleep, but of symbolism, a stage where power, trust, and tradition met in the quiet hours. And though his bed was softer, his blankets finer, the Viking king's slumber was still shaped by the same darkness, the same hearth glow, the same ancient rhythm that bound every Viking man, woman, and child. In that, the ruler and his people shared one truth. All were equal before the gods in the stillness of sleep. The warrior's rest was unlike that of hearth and hall, yet no less deep. A Viking man who had marched all day with shield and axe, or rowed the longship until his hands blistered, did not need soft beds to summon slumber. Fatigue itself was his blanket, and the nearness of his brothers in arms his comfort. On campaign, warriors lay where they could, upon cloaks, spread across earth, against shields propped in the grass, or aboard the ship, their bodies curled upon planks, still wet with spray. Yet, even here, sleep came swiftly, for it was earned with sweat and danger. On ships, the sea became their cradle. The longship rocked upon waves, its timbers creaking, its sails whispering against the night wind. Viking warriors, cloaked in wool, leaned against oars or huddled close, the salt air filling their lungs as eyes drifted shut. The rhythm of the sea lulled them, the swell and fall no harsher than a mother's rocking. A Viking child, had he been there, might have found it strange, yet to the seasoned warrior the sea's voice was as familiar as the crackle of a hearth. Dreams rose even here, of home, of feasting, of Valkyries waiting on distant fields. In camps, where fires burned low and weapons lay within reach, rest was cautious yet sure. A Viking man wrapped himself in cloak and shield, one hand upon his axe, and surrendered to slumber. The closeness of companions meant safety, the cough of a comrade, the murmur of a dream, the shuffle of boots, all were sounds that steadied the heart. To share sleep beside a brother was to know one would not wake alone to an enemy's blade. The Viking woman, though absent from the camp, lived in their dreams, her voice remembered in the hush before the dawn. On the eve of battle, when death's shadow loomed near, sleep still came. Some prayed before closing their eyes, whispering to Odin or Tyr for courage. Others lay down silently, hearts steady, their fate accepted. The sagas tell of men who slept soundly hours before their greatest fights, untroubled, as if the Norns themselves had soothed them into peace. For what fear could rob a Viking warrior of rest, when he believed his death, if it came, was woven long before? The warrior's rest was not fragile, but iron-bound, born of toil, brotherhood, and faith. Whether upon salt-stained planks, earth beneath the stars, or in the shadow of looming battle, the Viking man found his sleep. It was shorter, harsher, and often broken, yet it held the same depth, the same certainty as that of his kin at home. For even in war, the Vikings carried with them the gift of slumber, fierce, unshaken, and as steady as the rhythm of their own beating hearts. A Viking child did not drift to sleep alone in some distant chamber, but nestled in the heart of family life, where the hearth-fire glowed and kin lay close. The flicker of flame was their lullaby, its shadows dancing along timber walls, while the warmth of bodies pressed near offered comfort against the northern chill. In these close quarters, the lessons of slumber were learned not from words, but from the steady rhythm of Viking breathing, the soft murmur of parents' voices, and the weight of trust that came with sleeping side by side. The communal bedstead was both cradle and classroom. A Viking boy curled beside his mother would hear the quiet rustle as she turned, or the deep rumble of his father's chest as sleep thickened. A Viking girl, head upon straw, stuffed with herbs, would breathe in scents of woodruff and chamomile, weaving them into her earliest dreams. These patterns etched themselves into memory, shaping how the young would come to view rest not as solitude, but as shared survival. Nights in the longhouse taught children more than sleep. They learned patience, waiting for the right hush to close their eyes, and endurance when snoring shook the rafters, or a baby's cry split the stillness. They learned that warmth was found in numbers, that to share a bed with siblings meant laughter and whispered tales before drowsiness overcame them. Such bonds, woven in darkness, stretched into manhood and womanhood, binding kin with a strength as enduring as iron. Even the smallest Viking child absorbed the rhythms of the household. They rose when the rooster crowed, stirred when the fire was stoked, and lay back down when the night grew long and the hall hushed once more. Their bodies grew in tune with the turning of seasons, just as their minds grew in tune with kinship. Sleep was not apart from life, it was life, a thread braided into every day, as vital as bread and milk. Thus, the children of the hearth grew into Viking men and Viking women who knew rest as a gift, not a struggle. From their first days, wrapped in wool beside the flame, they carried within them the memory of warmth, the chorus of kin, and the deep ease of slumber. In learning how to sleep, they learned also how to belong. And so, in the quiet hours of night, the next generation of raiders, farmers, and storytellers was shaped their dreams, guarded not by solitude, but by the embrace of family and the steady glow of the hearth. To the Viking mind, sleep was never only the stilling of the body, it was a passage, a crossing into realms unseen. When the hall grew hushed and the hearth dimmed, dreams stirred as whispers of the gods. A Viking man who closed his eyes did not merely surrender to rest. He drifted into the wide shadowed fields, where Odin, all-father of wisdom, might press visions upon him. Dreams were not idle fancy, but woven messages, threads of fate stretched between waking and the divine. In the midnight hush, a Viking child might stir and speak of a bird that flew from fire to sea, or a woman cloaked in mist who beckoned from the threshold. Mothers and fathers listened closely, for even the ramblings of the young might bear an omen. To dream of ravens was to feel Odin's wings brush against the soul. To dream of wolves was to taste both danger and strength. In this way, slumber became prophecy, and no dream was cast aside lightly. The warrior in his bed, awaiting the morrow's clash, sought courage in his visions. If he dreamt of a ship gliding on still waters, he woke with calm in his heart. If he saw blood spill in the dark, he rose knowing his word drew near. A Viking woman, heavy with child, prayed for dreams of light and warmth, for they promised safe birth and strong offspring. In these nocturnal riddles, the people found guidance, assurance, or warning, as though the very gods leaned close to whisper. Dreams were offerings as much as gifts. At the temple, seers spoke of them with grave weight, unravelling their knots by the wisdom of runes. Yet each Viking held within his own heart the power to see meaning. The bond between dream and destiny was as strong as steel, and to dismiss it was folly. Sleep was not an escape, but a path, a sacred bridge across which gods and mortals met. Thus, when the Viking people lay down in straw, wool, or feather, they did so with reverence. Their slumber was guarded not only by kin at their side, but by the unseen hand of Odin and the host of gods who walked the dreamscape. In every breath of night, in every flicker of vision, they touched the eternal. To wake at dawn was to step back from those hallowed fields, carrying the echo of gods in their hearts, the secret strength that made their waking lives fierce, unyielding, and bound to fate. Night was never entered lightly by the Viking people. To them, sleep was a vulnerable crossing, a time when the soul drifted, and unseen forces prowled close. Before the Viking man, woman, or child surrendered to slumber, prayers and protections were spoken, woven like shields around the body. For in the dim hush of the hall, spirits might wander, trolls might stir in the forest, and dreams could be touched by both gods and darker beings. A Viking mother, tucking her child beneath the woolen cover, whispered charms older than memory. She might trace the sign of Thor's hammer above the bedstead, calling upon the thunder, God's strength, to ward off shadowed things. A sprig of juniper or rowan, bound and laid near the pillow, was thought to bar trolls from crossing the threshold. The flickering hearth-fire, left smouldering through the night, cast not only warmth but a warding glow, keeping spirits at bay. Warriors, hardened though they were, did not meet sleep unguarded. Before closing his eyes, a Viking man might murmur words to Odin, asking that dreams bring wisdom rather than torment. Others invoked Frigg, keeper of hearth and home, to protect their kin as darkness spread. Charms of iron, beads, or carved runes hung near the bed to bind unseen dangers, each one a promise that the sleeper's soul would return safely with the dawn. The halls themselves became fortresses of faith. In great mead halls, where men lay shoulder to shoulder, the murmur of shared prayers carried like a low chant, a chorus against the night. The sound of breath and the weight of kin gave strength, yet it was the whispered words, charms to banish trolls, to hold spirits beyond the fire's glow that sealed the night's safety. Even on longships beneath the open stars, a Viking sailor would clutch a carved amulet, trusting that his whispered prayer reached gods above and spirits below. Sleep was never mere rest, it was a sacred passage, and the Vikings met it armoured not only in wool and straw, but in faith. They knew the dangers of the unseen, and so they wrapped themselves in charms as surely as in cloaks. By dawn, when the rooster crowed and the world stirred again, they rose not only renewed in body, but preserved in soul. For in the Viking heart, it was not enough to dream one must wake, shielded and whole, to face another day of toil, feast, or battle. The Viking world knew no ticking clock, no metal hand chasing the hours across a numbered face. Time was written instead in the turning of the sun, the swelling of the moon, the slow crawl of seasons across the land. A Viking man laid down when the fire burned low and the sky drowned in darkness, and he rose when dawn's light brushed the timbered walls, or when the rooster split the silence with its cry. There was no worry of missed bells, no anxious tossing at the thought of a workday dictated by gears and wheels. Sleep came when it was called by nature, not by the hammering of a clock. This freedom was a gift. A Viking child did not grow restless staring into shadows, measuring the hours wasted. If wakefulness struck in the middle of the night, it was no crime against time, but a chance to sit with kin by the hearth, whisper prayers, share stories, or simply lie listening to the night's hush. Their segmented sleep, flowing like the tides, was not bound to shame or urgency. It was woven into the rhythm of the earth itself. A Viking woman, after the day's labour of tending food, weaving wool, or guarding the home, did not pace at the thought of too little sleep. She rested when her body bent with weariness, trusting that dawn would come whether her eyes closed swiftly or lingered awake. The warrior at sea did the same, his rest broken by watches yet free from the torment of counting hours. The sky itself told him when to rise, when to row, when to dream. Even in the king's chamber, where power could weigh heavier than iron, the nobleman was not bound to exact hours, but to cycles of light and season. In summer, short nights brought shorter rest, and the people bent to that truth without bitterness. In winter, when darkness lay thick across the land, sleep stretched long, deep, and heavy, as though the earth itself commanded it. Such freedom carved strength into Viking lives. They did not wrestle against the measure of time, for the measure belonged to the sun and the seasons, not to man. To live without the tyranny of a clock was to rest without anxiety, to dream without guilt, to wake without the sharp bite of bells. And so the Viking sleeper, whether warrior, farmer, or child at the hearth, gave themselves wholly to slumber, knowing they woke not at the command of metal hands, but at the call of the world itself, a freedom long lost to those who came after. The wisdom of Viking sleep was carved into the land itself, flowing with the sun and surrendering to the dark. Yet, in centuries to come, that wisdom was broken, not by sword or famine, but by the creeping hand of industrial change. Where once a Viking man had closed his eyes to the hush of the hearth and the long sweep of the night sky, men of later ages would be forced awake by the clang of iron and the crack of factory bells. The freedom of rising with dawn or lying longer through the winter, dark gave way to a tyranny of hours, carved into rigid shapes that no season could soften. The Viking child had grown with rhythms as natural as breathing, sleeping early in winter, lingering in wakefulness under summer twilight. This inheritance was scattered when new masters of time carved the world into minutes and hours. No longer could one wake gently to the crow of a rooster or the warmth of a mother stirring the hearth. Now, sleep was trimmed and broken, its flow shackled to the wheel of industry, its depth stolen by smoke and light that banished night too soon. For a Viking woman, slumber was once a sacred retreat, her weariness eased by wool bedding, by herbs stitched into straw, by the lull of voices in communal rest. But the age of machines stripped away such grace. Darkness was chased from the home by lamps that glowed like false suns, and sleep lost the gentleness of fading fire. To lie down was no longer to join the silence of earth, but to steal a few hours before the day's bell demanded toil again. Even the Viking warrior, who once lay fearless upon ship planks with the stars above as his only measure, would have pitied the soldier or worker chained to industrial time. There was no first sleep and second sleep, no freedom to rise at midnight for prayer or whisper, for even that pause had been labelled as inefficiency, a weakness to be scorned. Thus the forgotten wisdom slipped from memory, buried beneath the roar of machines and the blinding glare of endless light. Where Vikings had known sleep as a covenant with the natural world, their descendants were driven to treat it as a chore cut short, mistrusted, and ever measured. The gods no longer spoke in dreams, for there was no silence deep enough to hear them. And so the Viking legacy of sleep-free, unbound, and in harmony with sun and season became a whisper across time, a wisdom drowned by the age of iron. To sleep like a Viking today is not to lie on straw in a smoky hall, nor to huddle beneath a woolen cloak with frost clinging to the rafters. It is to reclaim what the Viking man, woman, and child knew without question, that rest was not an enemy to be conquered, but a companion as necessary as bread or breath. Their slumber was not torn into hurried scraps by false light or broken by the tyranny of bells. It followed the rhythm of earth and season, a pact with fire, darkness, and silence. The Viking warrior drifted into dreams not by force of will, but by the honest weight of labour, by rowing seas until his arms burned, or cutting timber until his back ached. No potion, no device, no restless thought was needed to summon sleep. The body, bound to the work of the day, fell as naturally as the sun itself. To remember this is to see that rest is earned through balance, toil answered by recovery, hunger answered by food, and weariness answered by the night. The Viking child, curled beside kin in the glow of the hearth, knew warmth not only of body but of spirit. Communal sleep meant more than comfort. It was safety, belonging, the knowledge that one was not alone against the dark. In our scattered, restless age, this lesson endures, that peace comes easier when one feels held, not only by furs or featherbeds, but by fellowship. And the Viking woman, who steeped her bed with herbs and whispered charms to guard against wandering spirits, reminds us that sleep is not merely flesh yielding to fatigue, but soul-seeking stillness. The scent of lavender, the hush of song, the prayer for protection, these were not luxuries, but necessities. To lie down was to honour both body and spirit. So, in the clamour of the modern world, to sleep like a Viking is to turn once more to what is simple, elemental, and true. It is to dim the false suns and trust the fading light, to welcome silence as the night deepens, to let labour guide the body into its rightful rest, and to dream as though the gods still speak in shadow. For the Vikings knew what we too often forget, that strength is not only forged in battle or toil, but in the quiet hours when the fire sinks low, the hall falls still, and the breath of sleepers becomes the heartbeat of the world.